What's up, guys? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master the final reading comprehension passage from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already taken that test, you can follow the link in the description below, try it first on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. We start by going through the passage itself. And then, for each question, we go over the question first and talk about what to look for in the answer choices, then we go over each individual answer choice. You can use the timestamps below to jump in between questions. All right, let's take a look at the final reading passage from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. As usual, we will spend a couple minutes up front going over the passage, making sure we get all the main points from each paragraph. So if you feel like you had a solid grasp of the passage, feel free to skip this part and go straight to the question analysis. So let's start with paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 introduces this question of whether we should hold corporations criminally liable for their wrongdoings or civilly liable. And paragraph 1 introduces the argument by those legal theorists who think that we should hold corporations civilly liable. And they argue that there are three things that make it better, right? Even though civil and criminal share a lot of features with each other, they both impose punishment, they both aim at deterrence, they both degrade the reputation of the company, but they say civil liability is better for three reasons. First of all, it's better able to determine appropriate damages. Second of all, criminal liability is too harsh on the reputation of the company, and that cost is going to be borne by society at large in the form of higher product prices. And finally, civil liability is more cost effective because criminal law has all these procedural protections that make it a lot more expensive to litigate. So those are three arguments in paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, however, this is the author responding to those legal theorists by saying, no, I think they're wrong. I think their arguments fall short. I think that criminal liability is actually the better way to go. And here are the author's three arguments, three rebuttals to paragraph 1's argument. The author says the considerable enforcement powers involved, including detaining, questioning corporate officials, that is a significant deterrent, right? Criminal liability is a much stronger deterrent than civil liability. That's number 1. Number 2 point in paragraph 2 is the fact that civil litigation requires an identifiable victim with enough money to commence litigation. That weakens its deterrent impact, right? Because civil litigation only works if there's a person that can actually sue, right? It can't be the government, it has to be a person, and that person has to have enough money to litigate. So that is a problem because I guess that's not always the case, and therefore that weakens the deterrent. That's argument number 2. And then argument number 3, most importantly, the main function of criminal law is to censure wrongdoing and to emphasize that we reject this conduct. And civil liability is not as well suited for that purpose. So criminal liability is better in terms of that, in terms of making an example, showing that society forcefully rejects this behavior. So that's the author's argument. Then in paragraph 3, we bring another argument against the author that the author's then going to rebut in the final paragraph. So paragraph 3 says, okay, fine, criminal sanctions are okay, but rather than holding the whole corporation criminally responsible, says the legal theorists in paragraph 3, rather than holding the corporations themselves responsible, what does this paragraph say? They maintain that individuals within corporations are more responsive to deterrence because they actually fear prosecution rather than the entity of a corporation. If you hold individuals in the corporation criminally responsible, that would be more of a deterrent to those individuals acting a certain way. And additionally, another point brought in this paragraph, punishment of a corporation in the form of a fine punishes shareholders, creditors, and employees who are going to lose their jobs, and ultimately the public, right, with the higher product prices. This sounds similar to something we said in paragraph 1. Those other legal theorists made a very similar argument. So that is the argument of paragraph 3 that says here are reasons why, even though, yes, criminal liability is perhaps better than civil liability, but we should be holding individuals criminally liable, not the entire corporation as an entity. But then paragraph 4, the author rebuts that argument as well, right? The author is defending this idea that no, we should hold the whole corporation criminally liable, right? Why does the author say in paragraph 4 that that approach is also misguided, that this second approach in the third paragraph by the other legal theorists, this is also misguided, right? Why is that not a good idea to try to criminally sue individuals in the corporation? Because corporations often bury responsibility within these complex hierarchies of people, and therefore you aren't going to be able to identify one individual responsible for some sort of wrongdoing. And another problem is that under this approach, if we're just going to be suing people in the corporation, then they will find it most cost effective to simply just designate an internal scapegoat to face prosecution rather than stopping to do those wrong things. And therefore, concludes the author by saying, the most effective way to function as a deterrent to corporations, right, to make them improve their practices, the best thing that we should do is to hold corporations themselves criminally liable for their conduct. And indeed, it actually works on shareholders as well as corporate officers and employees, right? Because criminal punishment decreases their wealth, it motivates shareholders. Now they have some skin in the game. They should push for better corporate practices. And then, yes, there are arguments that shareholders and employees need better economic protection than that, but that's outweighed by this greater societal interest in ensuring the safety of the public, employees, and the environment. So at the end of the day, says the author, criminally holding the entire corporation responsible for corporate wrongdoing is the best way to go, right? So paragraph 1 said maybe we should try them civilly. Paragraph 2 said no, we should try them in a criminal way, not civilly. And then paragraph 3 said, okay, even if we hold them criminally liable, maybe we should hold the individuals criminally liable, not the corporation as a whole. And then paragraph 4 said, no, that's got its problems also, and therefore the best thing to do is to just hold the entire corporation criminally liable for their wrongdoings. So that was pretty much the main point of the passage. So hopefully this all makes sense. Let's go ahead and look at the questions. 21, I think we know the main point of the passage. It's very simple. It's that we should hold corporations criminally liable for wrongdoing, period. That is the author's main point. In spite of those legal theorists that were arguing different things in the first and the third paragraph, that maybe we should hold them civilly liable, or maybe we should hold the individuals criminally liable. No, we should hold corporations criminally liable for their wrongdoing. So let's look for an answer that says that, plain and simple. That's the main point. A is perfect. A says, although a bunch of legal theorists have argued otherwise, right, criminal sanctions against corporations, legal theorists have argued against that. Although that's the case, it still remains the best way to deter corporate wrongdoing, right? Criminal sanctions against corporations as a whole, that's the author's main point, is that this is still the best way of doing things. Very simple. We knew that that was the main point. This is correct. B was some minor point made in there, right? That while civil sanctions would be more cost effective than criminal sanctions, yes, that's true. It's hard to identify victims of corporate wrongdoing who are going to have the resources to file those civil lawsuits. Yes, this was true. This was a point made in the second paragraph. However, this wasn't the main point. This was a very minor point in support of the main conclusion. The main conclusion was much simpler. It was that, therefore, criminal liability for the corporation is the best way to go. And B was a supporting reason for that more broad conclusion. So this was too specific. This wasn't the main point of the whole passage. C is a little too extreme, right? Because C says that these other two ideas, neither civil sanctions nor criminal sanctions against individuals, are capable at all of deterring corporate wrongdoing. That goes a little too strong, right? A little too far. It's not that they're not capable of deterring, it's that they're not as good at deterring as corporate criminal sanctions, right? And so therefore C is a little too extreme, first of all. And second of all, it misses the boat. It misses the main point. What is the main point? We're trying to say criminal sanctions against corporations are the best way because these other two ways don't work so well. So C just says these other two ways don't work too well, period, right? And in fact, it says they don't work at all, which is too extreme. So those are two reasons why C is wrong. D is inaccurate. D says that the thing the author thinks we should do is use criminal sanctions against corporations and also against individuals within corporations. No. Remember, that was the whole argument in the third and fourth paragraph. Should we hold the individuals liable? The author says, no, don't hold the individuals liable. Hold the corporation as a whole liable. So at no point does the author say we should hold both of them liable. E doesn't make sense. E says that using criminal sanctions against individuals is better to using civil sanctions. That's not the argument. we're trying to argue that neither of those two things are good, right? That neither of those two things are optimal, that we should use criminal sanctions against the entire corporation, right? We're trying to argue that neither of these two things are good ideas. Not that one is better than the other, but that neither is as good as holding the whole corporation criminally liable. So therefore, this is not what the author is saying. 22 is a pretty simple question. Why did the author mention that corporations bury responsibility in complex hierarchies? Well, that was at the beginning of the last paragraph. That was a rebuttal to paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 said, let's hold individuals in corporations criminally liable. But we said, no, that's a bad idea because corporations bury responsibility in these complex hierarchies, and therefore no individual responsible for corporate misdeeds can possibly be identified for us to sue that person. And therefore, it's a bad idea to hold individuals criminally liable. Rather, we should hold the whole corporation criminally liable. That was the point being made here. Let's look for that in the answers. A, no, this doesn't explain why they would want to appoint a scapegoat. That was a separate independent point in the next sentence, right? We said, first of all, they have these complex hierarchies, so we can't find an individual responsible for the misconduct. And second of all, another independent problem, right? It says another problem is that often they may even just appoint a scapegoat. So that was a totally different argument, right? The two things don't have anything to do with each other, right? I mean, they're obviously somewhat related, but it's not like one was a reason for the other. They were independent arguments. B doesn't make sense. B says that we mentioned this to make the argument of the people in paragraph 3, right? Those critics of corporate criminal liability who say that individuals are more responsive to deterrence. That was the argument made in paragraph 3. And then paragraph 4 says, no, that's a bad idea because of these complex hierarchies. And the reason is because the complex hierarchies make it impossible to find an individual that we can hold criminally liable. And therefore, this is backwards. B is saying it's highlighting the argument of paragraph 3, whereas in fact, it's actually arguing against paragraph 3. C doesn't make sense. C says we mentioned this to show how large the extent is that corporate criminal liability is unfair. No, this is the author's argument for corporate criminal liability in this paragraph, right? So we're not trying to show that it penalizes people unfairly. We're trying to argue that it's the best idea because holding individuals criminally liable is not as good of an idea. D, yes, perfect. This is exactly what we predicted. It's the only thing we could have possibly predicted, right? The author mentioned this as an argument for why holding individuals criminally liable in a corporation, why that's likely to not work so well, why it's likely to be impractical, because we won't be able to identify, it says in that very sentence, right? They bury responsibility in complex hierarchies, and therefore we won't be able to identify an individual responsible for corporate misdeeds to be able to bring the suit against. And therefore, this idea from paragraph 3 that we should impose criminal liability on individuals is a bad idea. So that's exactly what D is capturing and therefore is correct. E is a little extreme. We're not suggesting that critics that disagree with the author don't correctly understand the legal definition of criminal liability, right? The author never goes that far as to say that they don't understand the definition of this, right? This is just an argument against holding individuals criminally liable because of the complex hierarchies. We simply can't identify, it's a practical issue. We simply can't identify who the individual is that we're going to hold responsible, but it has nothing to do with any misunderstanding on the part of the critics that we're arguing with. 23. The legal theorists who recommend civil rather than criminal sanctions, what would they agree with? Which of these 5 things would they agree with? Well, their argument was presented in the first paragraph. So we have to find something that is sourced in the first paragraph. That's where we talked about these legal theorists and what their beliefs were. So whatever the right answer is, will probably have to be sourced from the first paragraph. Let's see if we can find something. A, do the legal theorists in paragraph 1 think that corporate criminal liability gives no incentive for individuals in the corporation to refrain from wrongdoing? No, that was not something that was ever said in the first paragraph. This kind of sounds like what paragraph 3's legal theorists were sort of saying, right? In paragraph 3, those legal theorists said that if you hold the individuals criminally liable, that would be more of a deterrence to them. But they don't even go this far. They don't say that corporate criminal liability gives no incentive for individuals. It's just that it's not as much incentive, right? But anyway, that was the third paragraph legal theorists. So certainly nothing like A in the first paragraph. B, there's no evidence for this. There's no evidence that the theorists in paragraph 1 think that there are too many procedural protections in criminal law. They do mention that there are a lot of procedural protections in criminal law, and they say that that's why we should use civil law instead against corporations, but they don't say that there are more than there should be. They don't say that we should change that. They just say that because that is the case, we should use civil liability against corporations instead. C, there's no evidence that the theorists in paragraph 1 think that censoring wrongdoing is not the primary function of criminal law, right? Just because the author said the opposite in the next paragraph, right? The author in paragraph 2 retorts to these people by saying censoring wrongdoing is the main function of criminal law, right? But that doesn't mean that they think the opposite. They never say in paragraph 1, it never says that those legal theorists think that there's something else that the main function of criminal law. It's not censoring wrongdoing. There's no evidence for what those people think. They might agree that this is the main function, right? They just think that they have their other arguments that are more significant, right? So there's no evidence what they think about this, right? This has to do more with the author's opinion. The author was the one who spoke about whether censoring wrongdoing is the main function of criminal law or not, right? The people in paragraph 1 did not give their opinion about that. D, there is evidence that the theorists in paragraph 1 think that this is true, right? The theorists who recommend civil rather than criminal in paragraph 1, they do say that the costs, that was one of their arguments, that the costs inflicted by criminal convictions are too high. That was one of those 3 arguments. I think it was the second one, right? It says in the middle of that first paragraph that furthermore, because criminal liability causes more of a loss of reputation, its overall cost to corporations is way higher than that of civil liability, and that additional cost is borne by society, and we're saying that's a bad thing, right? It's too high. The costs inflicted by criminal convictions are too high, says those legal theorists, and therefore we should do civil liability instead, and therefore D is definitely correct. E doesn't make sense. It seems to contradict with paragraph 1, because E says that those theorists think that generally the civil sanctions against the corporation don't harm the corporation's reputation, whereas it says the opposite, right? It says a couple sentences in that civil liability shares important features with criminal liability. They both impose punishment, they both aim at deterrence, and they both degrade a company's reputation. Both civil and criminal liability against a corporation does degrade that corporation's reputation, and therefore that is the opposite of what E is saying. 24, which of the following does the author think is true? Obviously, this could come from anywhere in the passage, so let's see if we can find an answer that is sourced somewhere in the passage as the author's opinion. A doesn't make sense because A is backwards. A says civil liability is better than criminal liability at assessing appropriate levels of damages. That was something that the legal theorists in paragraph 1 said, but the author doesn't agree with their argument, right? The author says criminal liability is better, so A is backwards. B, I can't find anywhere in the passage where the author says this, that employees are just as likely to be harmed by civil sanctions as by criminal sanctions. Where did the author say this? This would make sense. This would support the author's argument if it were true, right? Because the author's trying to argue that criminal sanctions are better than civil sanctions, right? So it would support the author's point, but the author never says this, right? The author's arguments are in the 2nd and 4th paragraph, and I can't see anywhere in those paragraphs where this is said by the author. C is misconstruing something from the first paragraph, right? So first of all, the first paragraph wasn't the author presenting the author's arguments. It was the author presenting other legal theorists' arguments. And second of all, even those legal theorists in that paragraph didn't say this. They never said that deterrence is the primary, the main aim of criminal and civil liability. They just said that both of those two things aim at deterrence, right? And that's what it says in the second sentence of the passage. It says, civil liability, these theorists argue, share features with criminal liability, and it says one of those features is that they both aim at deterrence, but it doesn't say that deterrence is the main aim, and also this isn't the author speaking, this is the legal theorist speaking, so those are the 2 reasons why C is wrong. D is backwards. This is not the author's argument. This is the people in paragraph 3's argument, right? Paragraph 3, those legal theorists were arguing that we should try individuals rather than corporations because the individuals are better deterred. It's more easy to deter them from wrongdoing than the corporations. That was the argument of the legal theorists in paragraph 3. The author then disagrees with that, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that D is something that the author believes. E is perfect. This is pretty much quoted straight from the 2nd paragraph. And remember, the 2nd paragraph was one of the paragraphs where the author was saying, here's what I think, right? And the author said, it was the 3rd or so sentence in that 2nd paragraph, it says, furthermore, private civil litigation requires an identifiable victim. Literally exactly what E is saying, almost word for word, and therefore this is correct. Number 25, those who support the criminal prosecution of individuals rather than prosecuting the corporation, in other words, the legal theorists in paragraph 3, what would they believe? So since this is referring to the people who stated their opinions in paragraph 3, the answer will probably be sourced from paragraph 3. So let's go ahead and look to see if we can find a good answer. A, it doesn't say anywhere in paragraph 3 that these legal theorists think that shareholders do not have the ability to influence a corporation to not commit wrongdoing. It never says that in this paragraph. The author in the rebuttal to these people says that shareholders do have the power to influence a corporation, but just because the author thinks that doesn't mean that the theorists with the opposing argument disagree with that, right? So we can't infer this, we can't guess this unless it's actually written in that third paragraph where we said, here are the views of these people that question 25 is about. And this statement is nowhere in that paragraph. B is a little too extreme because the people in paragraph 3 do say that employees have more incentive if they're subject to individual criminal prosecution, right? But B is too extreme. B says that they have incentive only. They only have incentive if they're subject to individual prosecution. So they have no incentive to refrain from wrongdoing if it is corporate prosecution. But that's not supported by this paragraph, by paragraph 3, right? These legal theorists in paragraph 3, it says they maintain that individuals are more responsive to deterrence, right? They're more responsive, which means that it's not that they only have incentive to refrain from wrongdoing if they're subject to individual prosecution. It's just that they have more deterrence that way than they would if we used corporate prosecution. C, it never says anywhere in paragraph 3 that legal theorists in that paragraph think this, that they think that it's harder to prosecute a corporation than it is to prosecute an individual. They never said that, right? It would support their argument, but they simply never said that. They had two arguments in this paragraph, right? They said that individuals are more responsive to deterrence, and then they say that punishing a corporation is unfair to the shareholders and creditors. They never say that it's more difficult to prosecute a corporation than it is to prosecute an individual, right? It's not in that paragraph. They never say it, and therefore this is wrong. D, we definitely know that the legal theorists in paragraph 3 think this. It's straight from paragraph 3, right? These legal theorists who are recommending that we prosecute individuals, not corporations. What was their reasoning? What was one of their arguments? Well, it says at the end of paragraph 3, they say that punishing the corporation in the form of a fine punishes shareholders, creditors, employees, and the public, which is forced to absorb higher prices. And these theorists are saying that's a bad thing, that's unfair to punish the public in this way, which is exactly what D is saying. D is saying that these theorists think it's unfair for the public to have to pay, through higher prices, the costs incurred by a corporation as a result of having done something wrong, right? And therefore, this is perfect, straight from paragraph 3 and correct. E is not what the theorists in paragraph 3 say. E is sort of what the author of the passage in paragraph 2 is saying, right? Remember, paragraph 2 was the author saying, here's why civil liability doesn't work as well. And one of the reasons was because corporate wrongdoing generally doesn't harm an identifiable victim. We need an identifiable victim in order to bring a civil lawsuit with enough money to bring that suit, right? And that was one of the weaknesses of civil liability according to the author. So this has nothing to do with what the theorists in paragraph 3 are arguing, and this question is asking you about the theorists in paragraph 3, so this doesn't make sense. 26, suppose a corporation is doing something wrong. They've been polluting a river with toxic waste known to increase cancer rates. Which one of the following scenarios would the author think would be appropriate, right, in terms of addressing this corporate wrongdoing? Well, we know what the author thinks. The author thinks we should hold the corporation as a whole criminally liable. That is very simply the main point of the passage. So all we have to do is look for an answer that says this corporation should be held criminally liable. Let's find that answer. A, in response to criminal prosecution of the corporation. This is the only answer that mentions criminal prosecution of the corporation, which is exactly what the author's been arguing the whole time should happen, right? Criminally prosecuting the corporation. That's the author's opinion. Therefore, this must be the right answer because no other of the four answers say that, right? And that's the author's main point in the passage. Criminally prosecute the corporation that does something wrong, right? So this is already right. And then it goes on to say other stuff that's also supported by the passage, right? It says in response to this criminal prosecution, a bunch of the shareholders put pressure on the board of directors to change their practices. Yes, it does say that. The author says that in the final paragraph, the last couple sentences, it says that criminal prosecution can motivate shareholders to push for better corporate practices. So yes, the author does think that this would be a good turn of events. So A is a very easy answer to select here because none of the other ones mention criminally prosecuting the corporation. B says in order to assist in civil litigation against the corporation, that's not what the author thinks we should do, right? The author's not in favor of civil litigation. We want criminal prosecution, right? So B says in order to assist civil litigation, the government expands the use of enforcement powers that usually are just reserved for criminal prosecution. We're going to expand them for civil litigation so that we can use civil litigation against this corporation. This is not what the author thinks we should do, right? The author thinks clearly that we should use criminal, not civil litigation. That's the whole point of the passage, in fact. C, no. C says that the largest shareholders are sued, right? No, the author thinks one thing and one thing only, that we should sue the corporation, criminally sue the corporation, not sue just a bunch of the shareholders, right? The author clearly thinks, no, we should hold the corporation as a whole criminally liable. That's the main point of the whole passage. D says that the city should prosecute the corporation's top executives. No, the author doesn't think that we should just pick a few top executives and prosecute them. The author clearly says, no, we should prosecute the entire corporation when they do something wrong. That is the author's whole point, right? Some other legal theorists thought that maybe we should identify one or two people that we should prosecute. But no, the author said, no, we shouldn't do that. We should prosecute the whole corporation. That's the main point of the whole passage. So D is definitely not what the author thinks. E says the city government and a bunch of residents of the city hold a press conference where they try to undermine the reputation of the corporation to pressure it to change its practices. That's not what the author's talking about in this passage. The author thinks that we should criminally sue corporations who do something wrong, right? E sounds nice. Maybe this would work too, but this isn't what the author is advocating. So there's no evidence that the author would think this. Final question, 27. This was probably the trickiest one on this passage for most people. The author would agree with which of the following, so let's find one that has a source in the passage. A is definitely not what the author thinks, right? A says that in a lot of instances, corporations that wouldn't have been deterred by the threat of criminal sanctions would be deterred by civil sanctions. No, the author's whole point is that criminal sanctions are a better deterrence than civil sanctions. So A is backwards. A is saying civil sanctions would work when criminal sanctions don't. No, that's not what the author thinks. The author says in paragraph 2 that no, criminal sanctions work better. They are a better deterrent than civil sanctions. B, I see no evidence for this anywhere. Where did the author ever mention what the main function of civil liability is, right? To punish harmful acts where there's no individual responsible for corporate misdeeds that can be identified. The author never says that this or anything is the main function of civil liability. The author did say in the second paragraph what the main function of criminal law is, but we never mention the main function of civil liability. At least the author never did anywhere in this passage. C, we have no evidence of current trends, right? C is not about what should or shouldn't happen. C is just saying currently corporations are more often subject to civil litigation than they are to criminal prosecution. There's no evidence for what actually happens in the real world anywhere in this passage, whether civil or criminal is more often, more frequent. There's no evidence for what actually happens. This passage is all arguments about what should, what is ideal. D, I can't see how this could possibly have any support from the passage. D says a lot of people who criticize using criminal sanctions against corporate wrongdoing, in other words, those people in paragraph 1, right, that was their whole point. They were saying don't use criminal sanctions, use civil liability instead. D says those people think that corporate wrongdoing rarely harms individuals. What? Where did they ever say that, right? I think everybody in this passage agrees, probably, that corporate wrongdoing can harm individuals. The question is, how do we treat corporate wrongdoing? What do we do? How do we sue them? Do we sue the corporations civilly or criminally, or do we sue the individuals in the corporations? But I don't think anyone's arguing over whether corporate wrongdoing harms people, right? I don't think that's ever a point of contention anywhere in this passage. E is correct. It's very tricky. A lot of people miss this question, but we do know that E is true. First of all, because none of the other 4 answers made any sense. But second of all, because this is sourced directly from the second paragraph, right? Doesn't this sound familiar, right? E says that in a lot of cases, corporate wrongdoing doesn't harm someone that has enough resources to sue. Doesn't that sound like one of the author's arguments in the second paragraph, right? The author's argument in the second paragraph was that private civil litigation doesn't work so well. Why? What was the middle point, right? Right in the middle of that paragraph. Why does private civil litigation not work so well, according to the author? Because it requires an identifiable victim that has necessary resources to commence litigation. And we're saying that that's a bad thing. That weakens its deterrent impact, right? That makes it less of a deterrence. Because, in other words, corporations are not as deterred because they know that there has to be an identifiable victim in order to be civilly sued. There must be an identifiable victim with enough money to sue. So corporations know that that's required, and so therefore corporations aren't as worried that it's going to happen. It doesn't deter them as much. Right? So the implication is that a lot of the times there isn't going to be that person that has enough money to sue that was a victim of the wrongdoing. Right? Otherwise, why would that be a weakness? The author's saying the fact that private civil litigation requires an identifiable victim with the necessary resources to sue, the author's saying that's a problem. That's why private civil litigation doesn't work so well, because it requires this. Well, the implication is that that thing that it requires isn't always going to be there. Because if it were always there, then why would requiring it be a weakness, right? So clearly the author is implying that in a significant number of the cases, there is no individual that was harmed that has sufficient resources to sue. And that's why this weakens the deterrent, because corporations know, oh, there isn't going to be a victim that has enough money to sue us, so we're not going to be as deterred against doing this wrongdoing. So hopefully this all makes sense. That's how you can infer directly from this paragraph that the author thinks that E is true. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.